Before I left Witchcraft, there was something we were trained to watch very closely. It wasn't your church attendance. It wasn't your social media posts. It wasn't even your prayers. It was whether you understood spiritual authority over your own life, because ignorance was the open door. I remember sitting in a dimly lit room during one of our late night gatherings. Candles burned low. Symbols marked the floor. And we weren't talking about random people. We were talking about believers, Christians who loved God but didn't understand how much authority they actually carried. And that misunderstanding was our advantage. We knew something many people in church did not realize: most spiritual oppression doesn't begin with dramatic events. It begins with small areas of neglect, unguarded thoughts, unresolved bitterness, fear that goes unchecked, identity that isn't grounded. Witchcraft thrives where identity is unstable. I didn't know it at the time, but what we feared most was not loud worship. It was informed believers. People who understood that spiritual strength isn't about rituals. It's about alignment. It's about truth. It's about knowing who you are and refusing agreement with lies. Tonight, I want to expose something that used to be discussed behind closed doors. Not to scare you, but to strengthen you. Because there were specific areas of the body and mind we believed represented access points, not because they were mystical, but because they symbolized agreement, thought patterns, movement, and speech. And when a person intentionally surrendered those areas to God, not through superstition, but through conscious prayer and repentance, we knew our influence weakened. This message isn't about fear of witchcraft. It's about reclaiming ground you didn't know you had given away. And if you stay with me through this entire message, you will understand something that took me years to unlearn. Spiritual freedom is not complicated, but it is intentional. In witchcraft, we were never as impressed by noise as we were by agreement. Agreement is quiet. Agreement is invisible. Agreement happens in the mind. That is why the first place we looked was never someone's house, never their bank account, never even their family line. We watched their thought patterns. Because the mind is where spiritual permission is formed. I need you to hear me carefully. Oppression does not begin with power. It begins with persuasion. If we could not persuade you, we could not influence you. When I was deep in the occult, we were trained to observe emotional cycles. Did someone constantly rehearse failure in their thoughts? Did they replay offense? Did they speak about themselves as unworthy, rejected, cursed, unlucky? That internal language mattered more than anything else, because whatever you repeatedly agree within your thoughts begins to shape your atmosphere. We didn't need to attack people who were already condemning themselves. We didn't need to push someone who already believed they were behind, forgotten, or spiritually weak. The agreement was already active. And here's the part most believers don't realize: spiritual authority begins in the same place, in the mind. The battlefield is not dramatic, it is internal, it is subtle, it is repetitive. That is why renewal of the mind is not a church cliché. It is a defensive strategy. When someone intentionally submits their thoughts to truth, when they interrupt lies, when they reject fear narratives, when they refuse to entertain condemnation, something shifts immediately. Not because of a ritual, not because of a formula, but because agreement has changed, and agreement determines influence. I remember one particular meeting where someone asked why certain believers seemed untouchable. The answer given was simple: they don't agree with us. It wasn't that they were perfect. It wasn't that they never struggled. It was that they refused to internalize the whisper. Fear knocked. They answered with truth. Shame knocked. They answered with identity. Condemnation knocked. They answered with grace. And without agreement, access weakened. This is why intentional prayer over your mind matters. Not as superstition, not as performance, but as alignment. When you consciously surrender your thoughts to God, when you ask Him to guard your imagination, your memory, your internal dialogue, you are not performing a ritual. You are closing doors that operate through consent. The mind is powerful because it is where belief lives, and belief is the root of spiritual authority. If you guard nothing else, guard your agreement, because when your thoughts align with truth, influence loses its grip before it ever reaches your circumstances. And that is where real spiritual strength begins. If the mind is where agreement begins, the mouth is where authority is released. Inside Witchcraft, we understood something many believers underestimate: words are not empty. Words establish direction. Words reinforce belief. Words create patterns. That's why we paid attention to how people spoke about themselves. Not occasionally, consistently. Did they constantly say, "Nothing ever works for me"? Did they declare, "I'm always behind"? Did they repeat, "I can't break this cycle"? Because repetition is reinforcement, and reinforcement becomes structure. You see, we didn't need dramatic rituals against someone who continually framed their own life with defeat. Their words were already shaping expectation. Expectation shapes perception, and perception influences decisions. It was never about superstition. It was about psychology meeting spirituality. When someone speaks failure long enough, they begin to anticipate it. When they anticipate it, they subconsciously align with it. And once alignment forms, change feels unnatural. That's how subtle bondage works. But here is the truth that changed everything when I left that world. The same mouth that reinforces weakness can release authority. I remember observing certain believers who refused to curse themselves with their own language. They were not denying reality. They faced problems. They experienced pressure. but they would not give their struggle a permanent label. Instead of saying, "I am cursed," they would say, "This is temporary." Instead of saying, "I am defeated," they would say, "I am growing." Instead of declaring, "I am stuck," they would say, "I am learning." That shift mattered, because words do not just describe your life, they frame your identity, and identity determines resilience. When you intentionally bring your speech into alignment with truth, when you choose gratitude over complaint, faith over fear, driven language, something shifts internally. You stop reinforcing the narrative that keeps you small. This is why intentional prayer over your words is powerful. Not because there is magic in syllables, but because discipline in speech retrains belief, and belief determines endurance. We used to say, behind closed doors, that the easiest person to influence was the one who constantly prophesied limitation over themselves. But the hardest person to touch was the one who guarded their tongue. They didn't speak carelessly. They didn't rehearse negativity. They didn't empower fear with repetition. They were intentional. And intentional people are difficult to manipulate. Your mouth is not just for expression, it is for alignment. When your words match truth, your confidence stabilizes. When your speech reinforces hope, your internal posture strengthens. When you refuse to echo every negative thought out loud, you weaken its authority over your emotions. That is not superstition. That is structure. So if the mind is where agreement begins, and the mouth is where authority is released, then you begin to understand something powerful. Influence collapses when alignment changes. Guard your thoughts. Guard your words. Because when both are aligned with truth, you become spiritually resilient in ways the enemy cannot easily penetrate. And that is where freedom begins to take visible shape. This is where things become uncomfortable for many people because it forces honesty. In witchcraft, we were never confused about this. What you consistently watch and listen to shapes you, not instantly, not dramatically, but gradually and deeply. We didn't need someone to attend a ritual for influence to enter their life. We only needed access to their attention, because attention is agreement in slow motion. We paid close attention to what people consumed when they were tired, bored, lonely, or emotionally unguarded, late at night, early in the morning, in private moments when no one was watching. Those were the windows where influence entered most easily. Fear, heavy content, sexualized imagery, constant negativity, music that normalized despair, rage, or hopelessness, endless scrolling that left the mind overstimulated and the spirit exhausted. None of that looked spiritual on the surface. That was the point. Influence works best when it doesn't announce itself. Over time, what enters through the eyes and ears begins to shape inner dialogue. Inner dialogue shapes belief. Belief shapes behavior. And behavior shapes outcomes. That chain is predictable. This is why some people feel spiritually dull, emotionally irritable, or mentally foggy without knowing why. It's not always attack. Sometimes it's saturation. Too much noise, too much darkness normalized as entertainment, too little intentional stillness. We were taught that people who disciplined their intake were far harder to influence. Not isolated people, disciplined people. Those who chose carefully what they allowed to shape their imagination and emotions. They didn't avoid the world out of fear. They guarded their inner atmosphere out of wisdom. When someone intentionally surrendered their eyes and ears to God, choosing what they watched, listened to, and allowed to replay in their mind, something changed. Their thoughts became clearer, their emotions steadier, their reactions slower and more intentional. And that stability disrupted influence. This is why prayer over what you see and hear matters, not as superstition, but as stewardship. Your senses are gates. Gates are meant to be guarded, not shut down. Guarding doesn't mean isolation. It means awareness. You don't have to consume everything available to you. You don't have to normalize what drains you. You don't have to let every voice have access to your inner world. When you become intentional with what enters your eyes and ears, you reduce confusion, you increase clarity, you strengthen discernment. And discernment is dangerous to manipulation because manipulation thrives in noise, distraction, and emotional overload. But when your senses are aligned, your inner world becomes quieter, and in quiet, truth becomes easier to recognize. If the mind is where agreement begins, the mouth is where authority is released. Then the eyes and ears are where influence tries to sneak in. Guard them wisely, because what you repeatedly allow in will eventually shape what comes out. And the more intentional you become, the less room there is for anything else to take root. By the time I left witchcraft, there was one truth I could no longer ignore. Influence could only go as deep as the heart allowed it. We could observe thought patterns. We could listen to speech. We could watch habits and intake. But at the core of every person was something far more powerful than any external pressure: their will. The heart is not just emotion. It is intention. It is loyalty. It is what you ultimately choose to align with when no one is watching. And this is where many cycles either continue or finally break. Inside the occult, we understood that unresolved wounds created internal openings, bitterness that was never confronted, shame that was never processed, trauma that was buried instead of healed. When pain is hidden, it often becomes agreement with lies about identity. I deserve that. I will always be rejected. I can't trust anyone. Those internal vows are powerful, not because they are mystical, but because they shape behavior, and behavior reinforces belief. But here is what we feared most when someone invited God into those hidden places honestly. not theatrically, not performatively, honestly. When a person confronted their own bitterness and chose forgiveness, when they admitted fear instead of hiding it, when they surrendered pride instead of protecting it, that shift weakened every pattern we relied on, because the heart had changed alignment. And when the heart changes, everything downstream begins to shift. That is why the hands matter too. Your hands represent action. What you build, what you touch, what you participate in, what you repeatedly choose. Many people pray for change, but continue patterns with their hands. They ask for peace, but entertain chaos. They desire freedom, but return to habits that reinforce bondage. We observed this constantly. But when someone's heart and hands aligned, when their internal surrender matched external action, cycles broke faster than expected, not instantly, not magically, but consistently. Consistency is powerful. You do not break cycles through dramatic moments alone. You break them through steady alignment. Choosing truth again tomorrow. Choosing discipline again next week. Choosing forgiveness again when old memories try to resurface. Freedom is often quieter than oppression, but it is stronger. When your heart is surrendered and your hands reflect that surrender, manipulation loses leverage. Because leverage requires contradiction, a divided will, but a unified person is difficult to influence. This is what I had to learn after leaving witchcraft. The power we thought we had was often exaggerated by people's unexamined wounds, unguarded thoughts, undisciplined speech, and unmanaged intake. But when someone becomes intentional, mind aligned, words guarded, senses disciplined, heart surrendered, actions consistent, influence collapses. Not because you performed a ritual, but because you removed agreement. And once agreement is removed, access fades. That is the truth we never wanted believers to understand. Spiritual strength is not dramatic, it is aligned. And when you align every part of yourself, your thoughts, your words, your senses, your heart, your actions, you are no longer easily moved by external pressure. You become steady, and steady people are hard to shake.